Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate, a podcast by the Institute for Replication, where we put research to the test again. In this episode, Felix Holzmeister tells us about prediction markets and their use within economics. Hello everyone, I'm your host Juan Pablo. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here joined with our co-host Abel, and we have a special guest today. His name is Felix Holzmeister. He's an assistant prof at the University of Innsbruck, and we'll be talking to him about prediction markets. But before we jump into that, I'll let Felix introduce himself, and let's just start with this amazing episode. Felix, hello, how are you?
Hi, thanks. I'm very fine. Thank you very much for having me. So it's a great pleasure, and I'm very curious to chat with you about my research. So curious whether you are really as interested as you're supposed to do. So let's see.
No, we are. I think it's an amazing not only topic but a subject that a lot of people don't necessarily know about. So, Abel, you were just telling us a bit before we started the recording that you have been part of some of Felix's experiments. Why don't you tell us a bit your experience as an outsider looking into this, and then we will let Felix tell us a bit about the whole ingraining and how does it all work.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I thought like it would be really cool to have Felix on the podcast, because I remember receiving an email from you or from Anna Dreber, I forget now, but basically asking me to be a participant. So not a co-author, not collaborator, just like, just the participant in the experiment. And I thought it was a really cool experiment. This is a couple of years ago. But I really didn't know what I was getting into, to be honest. I didn't have like a lot of experience with prediction markets. And I remember just like, starting and seeing a list of studies and having to sort of decide whether I thought like, oh, this study clearly is replicable using new data. This one is not. And there were like papers on, all the papers were using Mechanical Turk to collect the data. So the original studies were using Mechanical Turk as the platform to collect participants. But their studies were so different. And I remember trying to decide which studies I thought were replicable or not, and thinking about like sample size, power, whether the studies is just, you read it and you're just laughing, you're thinking like, this is crazy. Or whether you're just thinking, okay, this makes sense, I buy it, just like the thumbs up, like, and it got me thinking in so many different ways of like, this could be huge in terms of understanding like which studies we should replicate, the ones we should focus on, but just better understanding like maybe what's the role of an editor or a referee. And so if you could tell us like, what's the backstory behind this paper? How did you get interested in prediction markets, or why did you think it was so important to get like experts and trying to figure out like, are they going to be able to predict which studies are replicable or not? And just, heads up, like for people listening, you also replicated all these studies, which is so interesting. So we actually have the ground truth to some extent about like, were my predictions and the predictions of so many people like off completely, or are we doing a good job? So let's just go for it.
Okay, and before we jump into that, could you just tell a bit what are prediction markets? What should we know? Like a brief introduction into the world for those of us who have no idea what we're talking about.
Okay, so let's start with this point. So prediction markets, I think it's quite well known in other forms of applications. So probably they are best known for in the context of political polls. So whenever there are political elections, there are typically prediction markets as an alternative to representative polls, and they typically function pretty well in this regard. So I think it was Anna Dreber and colleagues who initially started out with this idea of applying prediction markets to assess the replicability of experiments or of scientific replications of scientific claims. And this was actually my very first starting point when I started off with my academic career. So it's now almost 10 years ago, actually. So I have my 10-year anniversary this year, I realized. And it was the very first project I joined when I started as a PhD student. So I was part of this experimental economics replication project. And as part of this project, we also collected data via survey predictions or on survey predictions and on prediction markets. And I found this quite an interesting idea and a worthwhile avenue to pursue. And I was not alone with this judgment. And so whenever replicating stuff in follow-up projects, we always use prediction markets as a part of the project. And interestingly, they seem to work quite well, but still far away. They are still far away from perfect, right? So it really seems that people have some decent priors about whether something is reliable, whether findings are credible, whether we can trust particular estimates, yes or no, whether they would hold up again if re-estimated in new data. And the consequence of this process of seeing that they perform quite solid. So as I said, it's correlations of around 0.7, but better than chance. Okay, so it's far off. So there is quite some scope for improvement, which is not clear how to utilize. But at least they do it. They do better than chance. And our idea for the most recent project, where Abel participated as a forecaster, was to use this basic setting or this potential that peers, that scholars have a decent understanding of whether something is credible or not, as a mechanism to select and prioritize which studies to replicate. Because one of the challenges in terms of this entire field of replication is that it's costly, it's time-consuming, it's not that easy to publish. So we have scarce resources, and therefore it would be cool to have some mechanism, some procedure to decide on, okay, which studies should we prioritize in the selection for replicability checks. So we did this in the context of online experiments. So we selected a set of, I think, 41 or 42 studies from conducted on MTurk, published in PNAS, and we run markets on it, but not in the sense of prediction markets, but in this case it were so-called decision markets, which are basically, in structure-wise, they are the same thing. But the crucial difference is that with decision markets, the market outcomes determine what will eventually be replicated based on a predetermined decision rule. Okay, so we announced the decision rule. So we had the rule that the 12 the 12 articles or the 12 findings with the highest prices and the 12 articles with the lowest prices will be replicated for sure. And in addition, in order to make it incentive compatible, we picked 2 additional ones at random. Okay, so we replicated 26 out of the 41 based on the realized prices. And again, what we see, because we eventually conducted the replication, so we have this quasi ground truth information. And we see a similar pattern as in the prediction markets beforehand. So it works fairly well. Still not perfect, but at least it can help as a tool to identify which studies to prioritize. At least
so
that's what.
Let me jump in here. In theory, if we believe that these decision markets and prediction markets are working, what you would want to do is only do the studies that you think that are not going to replicate. But in this case, you decided to go for the 2 extremes in a sense, right? So those that we think clearly should replicate, that's what the market decided. And those that we think are not replicating at all. And just as a proof of concept, I guess. But going forward, you would think that those that we want to put our money and efforts are those that we think are not going to replicate, correct?
Yes and no. So I think that the nice thing with decision markets is that they are pretty flexible, because one could be quite creative in determining the decision rules. So for our project, we really used the extremes. So we went for those with the highest prices, those with the lowest prices, with the rationale in mind that it maximizes power, because we also had quite limited resources and we cannot replicate 100 studies or more. So eventually we ended up with 26, and in order to maximize the power of our tests in comparing top to bottom, it was most reasonable to go for the extremes. Applying it in practical terms, I think there might be quite some interesting decision rules. One natural one would be to focus on those with the lowest priors, in order to get rid of potential or likely false positives and correct for them. Other quite natural decision rule might be to go for those that are closest to 0.5. So where uncertainty among peers is largest, so where the gain in knowledge in terms of knowledge accumulation might be largest by adding additional evidence. There's probably not so much point in replicating those with the highest priors, although occasionally we should do so in order just to verify that things are working the way we suppose they should.
This is so interesting, Felix. Like, because if you think about it from a high level perspective, this would become sort of a wisdom of the masses kind of thing when it comes to papers, and would be very useful to target specific pieces of knowledge that we think are not of the highest standard. Let's put it that way. And this, and I know you've done this for COVID, it would be especially interesting for instances in which there's an upcoming like wave of papers that we need to evaluate pretty quickly. But something that comes to mind is Goodhart's law. You know, the idea that when something becomes a measure of something, then it stops becoming like a good measure, right? What do you think about this idea that if prediction markets become sort of the norm in trying to assess, let's not say credible research, but let's say research that seems to be credible, then people would start tweaking their own research to become this, like to be camouflaged as good research. What do you think of this idea?
Yeah, it's a potential caveat of it. It might be a potential danger indeed, that people or researchers start to try to anticipate how forecasters would evaluate or which factors forecasters would base their predictions on in order to be positively evaluated in markets or survey forecasts. Probably it's a relatively...
Isn't that a good thing? You would think like statistical power, like it's what? FX sizes that are too large to be true. It's the credibility of the design. Isn't that like, what are the predictors in general? Like when you talk to forecaster and when you evaluate their data,
exactly,
what do they seem to care about the most?
I think so what we see in the data is that people focus a lot on sample size, on p-values, and kind of inferred power, somewhat on effect sizes, and altogether this ends up with quite reasonable forecasts in many cases. Of course, there might be more subtle pieces of information that they factor in, like reputation of authors or personal stories that they heard through the grapevines or whatsoever. So that's hard to infer in data. But if people rely on power in order to forecast or to make predictions, it's probably not a bad thing if researchers anticipate that people will look for power. So that's actually something that research as a whole could benefit from, because it makes it more salient what people are aiming for or looking for when assessing the credibility of research findings.
One thing I want to go back to, and I was really surprised when you said this. To me, there's like a couple of stylized facts coming out of like all the studies that you and so many other people are doing it. And I love these studies. The first one is we're better than luck, which thank God you would argue,
Yeah.
but we're not doing amazing.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say like we're around 0.6 to 0.8 in most of these studies in terms of prediction market, somewhere in that range? There's going to be a lot of studies that we think are not going to replicate. That's the prior. But actually, when you do it, they actually might replicate. Exactly. And you can imagine the other around, right? This is happening to some extent. So to me, I'm quite surprised by the idea that we want to focus on the ones that are close to 0.5, where we're not really sure. We would want more like, information to be sure whether that's really a study we should be focusing on or not. Or not that, but more like, is it a credible study or not? Is it going to replicate? We're not sure. The experts are not sure. Lots of uncertainty. I get that from I get it from just like a point of view of there's a lot of uncertainty. Let's go for it. But I really don't get it from a practical point of view where you would want to show clear evidence that some studies, in addition of having the experts thinking this is not replicable, like this is not like a good study, you want to prove that. Because I think science just does not self-correct quickly. And you would want to really make sure that there's not a new strand of literature that starts building, off that study, which might not replicate and might, most experts would think like it's not good. Or do you see it more as we should have an app that researchers use when they have nothing to do? Like, I'm going to the toilet, I'm just going to use the app.
Like
and
a
then
Tinder.
It's like a Rotten and Tomatoes. And instead of being movies, it's actually papers.
Yeah.
And then you just like, I look quickly at the study. Here's the sample size. The app gives you information about like sample size, effect sizes, things like this. And you just quickly decide, and then it becomes like rotten or, and is this the idea? And then we replicate the one close to 0.5, or I don't know. It's an interesting conversation.
I think that this idea of replicating those close to 0.5 because of the largest uncertainty, this is quite intriguing in a world where we don't have to cope with a lot of uncertainty about the credibility at large scale. I think it's probably just too early to consider this the most attractive decision rule. I think first we need to get rid of all the problems that translate into high shares of false positive results and make research outputs more credible as a whole. And once this level is reached, so once we have a desirable higher standard, we can probably think about, okay, let's now in terms of, so from this meta point of view that eventually it's all about knowledge accumulation. Once we are at this point where we can really focus on accumulating knowledge rather than correcting potentially flawed evidence, it would be natural to go for those where uncertainty is highest. But it's probably a far stretch so far, so, or as of now. So I think for now, I consider it most interesting to use it as a tool to identify studies which are considered likely to be flawed or probably even false, such that it's worthwhile to replicate it in order to correct published records. An interesting aspect of this entire idea of predicting failures to replicate is something that puzzles me always quite a bit, is that, okay, so if people really have decent priors about whether something is credible, would be replicable if repeated, and so on and so forth, why doesn't this enter already at an earlier stage, for instance, during peer review? So why at all do make these papers their way to the published literature if people find it so obvious that it will be very unlikely that it replicates or that it's mostly credible?
I'm going to push back on this for two reasons, I think. The first one is some of these studies are old. By old, I don't mean like 1993.
Yeah.
But I mean, they've been published for a couple of years. And I think if you would have done that expert forecast at the moment of publication, I think some of the results would have been different.
Probably. Yeah, fair point.
But I wanted to...
point. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I wanted to say something, because that's a very, very interesting point that you're raising, like how this plays out with the whole editorial process. But if you think about it, like from a reviewer standpoint, what kind of argument is like, I don't think this would replicate? It's a difficult argument to make as a reviewer. Like when you get the paper, you're supposed to evaluate the paper on its merits, on what it's presenting to you. So I think the markets are very good because it gives like an overall evidence. The overall scientific community, no, I will not say the overall scientific, I would say a nice mass of researchers thinks this paper doesn't replicate, which is a very different argument compared to this one referee thinks that it won't replicate. You know what I mean? It goes back to the idea of the wisdom of the masses, because sometimes I've gotten this kind of papers with, I don't know, let's say 100 observations. And you as a referee, you know that this thing would have a very hard time replicating, you know? But I don't know, I feel bad saying in the letter or in the report, like, hey, I don't think this thing would fly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a difficult argument.
It's a different argument. No, definitely. I fully see your points. I just believe that this prediction market results and decision market results are an invitation to reconsider the review processes that we rely on for basically ever. Because I think that it's an interesting idea to think about an alternative mechanism, like, for instance, relying on wisdom of the crowds rather than on two hand-picked selected reviewers, which might be experts or not. Probably would be an interesting alternative to say, okay, instead of inviting two reviewers to write up 5-6 page reviews, let's invite 20 people and ask them to just provide us with a few Likert scale items on aspects that we deem most important from the viewpoint of whether something should be published or not. Okay? I consider this quite an intriguing idea, and I could well imagine that this could help to enhance credibility overall. Or probably it could be at least combined with the standard review process, because this would be something that could be quite easily implemented. So as Abel suggested, let's introduce a researchers hub as an app where you can just rate papers or claims directly on your phone, which something like this could be the first hurdle to determine whether something is worthwhile for full review or something like that. Okay, but it would be based on a broader perspective rather than just on a few single opinions. And that's something that I find an interesting. Not sure whether it would work out. Not sure whether it would be superior to the current system. But at least it's something that could play out quite well. I think.
An extra tool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because no, go for it.
I was gonna say, we're all economists, so let's have like an econ conversation for a second, and we apologize for everybody else who's not an economist listening. But it's well known, for instance, that there are journals, top journals, like, I'm not gonna make friends, but I'll say it anyway, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, let's say. I personally think that they're publishing studies where, if you would ask a lot of economists whether they think this is like a good study, or maybe our priors are that this is a bit like bullshit-ish, I don't have a problem with a journal like this taking a lot of risk and publishing papers that they think could be a breakthrough, they're not sure, or could be just like bad research and we should never have published this. I don't have a problem per se in a journal doing this. You don't want all the journals to do this, but having like researchers and journals actually taking chances and exploring things that are like, I don't know if I'm buying this. Like, to some extent, you need this. I think my problem with UGE is they do that to some extent, I would argue, but they don't publish comments that say, we should not have published that one. So I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
That they let other journals trying to figure it out, and the other journals are not necessarily interested in publishing comments and replication, as we know. But I don't have problems with researchers taking like chances or working on things that most people would think like, no, this is nonsense. This does not replicate for sure. And having journals publishing those. I think to some extent you need this in science. You need people to try new things and
of course,
fail.
Definitely.
And so that's why I think you want to replicate these studies. And you want, like, if most people in the discipline think like this is nonsense, they should never have published this. I think this is the study you should absolutely replicate as soon as possible. But I don't have a problem with the idea that it's getting published in a top journal, actually. I have no problem with that. I would even like encourage it, as long as the journal is willing to let other people having a look, and this starts like more a conversation I
No,
don't know, like
I
you seem
fully
to
agree.
agree with some of it.
So I fully agree on this idea that we need explorative, long shot uh, projects that are super risky, and they should, of course, become published. The question is that is not very clear to me is what's the role of journals in this entire discussion, because I think we of course journals played an important role 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, where it was important to an important instrument to disseminate research across the globe. Uh, Things have changed quite a bit in the last few decades. So, technically speaking, journals are just not really needed. There would be other means to disseminate research nowadays because we have the internet. It could be quite easy. The only real role that journals fulfill nowadays are they serve as filters, and they serve as supposed quality signs, right? So they add this quality signal, which is not very clear whether it is appropriate, yes or no, because we all know that impact factors can be managed, and a lot of impact factors depend on single publications that have been curated for decades, and so on and so forth, right? Um, so the role of journals should probably just reconsider. And I think that if we would have something like a preprint server, like Meta Archive, and would couple it with a peer review system and with a transparent options to discuss research in an ongoing manner. So just to say, there is an option for adding comments and publishing comments alongside articles, such that they are available with the original article, or such that we can just add uh, a replication without writing up a full-fledged paper, but just saying, okay, we did the same thing. Here's our data. Here's our results, and I added just as a comment to add to the evidence base. I think this would be way more efficient way in order to accumulate knowledge on the whole, right? And then you could even integrate something like a simple rating system with 0 to 5 stars, like on Amazon or something like that. So there would be means. I think we could be way more creative in how we can ensure quality standards while ensuring transparency and allowing for the discourse rather than this piecemeal way of, there's an original paper, now someone will probably try to replicate, if at all. They will have a hard time to get it published, so probably it will be hard to integrate in meta-analysis and so on and so forth. And 10 years later, it's super hard to synthesize all the evidence that is out there because it's so hard to find, because it's completely dispersed over so many different places. I think if we would aim towards a more centralized system, it would be time to aim for something like this.
Felix, I love this take, but I wanted to poke your brain a bit further on this route, because while I do agree that in the era of the internet, the idea of journals has become somewhat, I won't say obsolete, because obsolete is a very hard word, but I would say it's a bit dated in the way journals have handled the access to information and all this. I do want to play devil's advocate to an extent when it comes to something that Abel said, that probably some novel research is worth publishing, even if it challenges all our priors. So what I mean by that is, let's say research comes along and it ticks all the boxes in terms of statistical power, sample size, expected size of the effect, whatever. But then it goes against all of our priors. Right? A research like that would likely do very bad in the Rotten Tomatoes app, right? Let's say a research that says that education is bad, right? Something outrageous. Imagine something like that. Probably it would do super bad in the Rotten Tomatoes app. But if it's done with all the careful ideas and it's taken care of, it's probably worth publishing in one of the top journals. You know what I mean? Just for this conversation starter kind of thing. Like it probably pushes our discipline in ways that that is hard to understand. So I wanted to have your take on this kind of stuff. Research that probably won't do very well on the wisdom of the masses kind of thing, of the crowds, but it's pretty important research. For example, what I'm thinking of is, let's say, something like Becker back in the day, right? This guy is publishing on the economics of marriage, right? And everyone everyone is thinking that this guy is wasting his career. Like, there's a very famous letter from Solo, I think, saying that, mate, you're too smart to be doing this, right? But nevertheless, the guy pushed forward and created like a whole new area of research. What do you think? Would it be something like, instead of relying on the crowds, would be like sending the mob after this paper? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, as I said, I think if we would have something like wisdom of the crowd based evaluations, this would likely be an indicator for where to look closer, where to look for additional evidence, and so on and so forth. So if there is some very disruptive piece of new evidence which comes very unexpected, it would likely end up with low ratings on whatever kind of scale in terms of replicability. So it's an invitation for others to actually replicate. So if then someone finds support for this disruptive claim, it's backing things up and probably updates. So there is this kind of Bayesian updating in terms of whether this is credible or not. And this is probably the process that we need in accumulation of knowledge, in a sense, right? So it's of course there will be challenges. So our priors will be challenged, and in order, if our priors are challenged, we want to see new evidence, and we will update our priors based on new evidence. And if new evidence is supportive of this claim, and our priors are really challenged, we need to think about, okay, what are the reasons, what are the mechanisms in order to update our priors in such a way that we can that it fits with our view of the world, right? So I think that this is quite a natural way. Of course, this is all super, super far-fetched, and it will be hard to even think of how to implement something like this. But at least I think it's worthwhile to think a bit out of the box about potential alternatives to this standard, to this relatively outdated standard system of publishing, where everything is handled as if stuff would still be printed in hard copies and sent around the world via postal mail, right? So, which is, bless God, not happening that much anymore. But still.
It's so funny you're saying this, because we have a comment on the review at a top journal on economics. I'm not going to say which one. And the editor was like, Abel, we have page limits in our volumes and issues. And I've been trying to fight for like years now as the editor-in-chief, one of the two editor-in-chiefs, to try to remove, to move everything online. And I failed. So I don't think we're going to have enough space to publish your comment. And I was like, what? This is like 2025. What are we doing? Just dump stuff online. Who cares? It's an archaic, we live in a world where some of the things we do in science have not changed in decades or even like a century, which is crazy when you think about it. So I'm going to entertain your idea because I've heard it so many times. And let's go through it for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I don't care. Imagine we move to like a Rotten and Tomatoes system or 5-star system. And I just go online and I can write comments live saying, I don't like this paper. Clearly you need to write a review. You cannot just click. You need to write something. The identification doesn't make sense, whatever, etc. And then the authors can respond if they want. They choose to or not. Quickly, I think you would get to a point where you would have like super reviewer who would spend their entire life doing this. And some of them would receive like a super reviewer like title or whatever. Yeah. And maybe you can sort, and then these people, their reviews count more. You can decide how much weight you put or whatever. Right?
I said we could be super creative in coming up.
Yeah, you could. You could. But then you want to have like dinner with these super reviewers. You want to have good relationship with them. You need to like them, and then if they're in your network, that's good. and then they sort of become a bit like editors, and then I don't know, like, are we what are so here's my question to you: what are the biases, the main ones that you're trying to get rid of, and how does this new system solve or partially, let's say, remove these biases? Because I've heard this idea countless times in the open science movement, and I think some of it is good. It's a good idea. It makes sense. But I think a lot of people are not thinking through it fully, how that system would actually work, and how actually making friends would be really important, how left-wing people who dominate academia would dominate this sphere, and then it would become a bit like a Twitter thing. And you know what I mean? Like, like, what are the main things you don't like about the current system, and how does this solve these problems?
Okay, so first thing, I'm not entirely sure whether it would be worthwhile to aim to
That's a good answer.
aim to switch to something completely new, because it's just uncertain. It's just not clear whether it would do better, right? So we would need some form of evidence in order, but at least I think it's worthwhile to think out of the box, given that we rely on these outdated standards. What I really don't like about these outdated standards is that it's highly reliant on single opinions. And we know from at least some studies that the reliability, so inter-rater reliabilities across reviewers and editors, are super, super low. So with these low levels of correlations between reviewers, for instance, there's just an extremely high false positive and false negative rate.
So what you're saying is, I guess we read the same studies. The editors almost always agree with the referees, but the referees between them provide completely different comments and type of feedback. And arguably, you would argue that it's not normal. It should be more similar. That's what you're arguing, right?
Yeah, at least it's just a super, super noisy signal, right? So if I select two experts and ask for their opinions, fair enough, they can be experts in this domain, and their comments may be super reasonable and helpful, but their overall evaluations may still differ quite a bit because the signal itself is super noisy. In order to get rid of this noise, we would need larger amounts of reviewers. So we would need to way more reviewers than two. So this could be at least some way to get rid of these idiosyncrasies, which makes publication in journals more somewhat like a lottery, right? So, and we all know this. It's in many cases submitting. So you submit papers where you really believe that this would perfectly fit in this outlet, and it's just desk rejected within a few hours. And then you have these papers where you consider it to be a super far shot for this particular journal, and all of a sudden it's reviewed and probably eventually accepted. So there is a lot of unexpected things happening, and I find this so weird because we are so reliant on the entire publication system, because academic careers are just so much reliant on reputations of journals, on the amount of publications, on citations. Everything circles around these quantification of research outputs in terms of quality and quantity. And this is, at least for me, super hard to understand. We put so much weight and so much emphasis on publications in top outlets, for instance, although we all know that the decisions whether someone get published in top outlet are not merely quality based, but there is at least a substantial element of luck involved, to the good and to the bad, right? So it goes in both directions. It's not necessarily a bias, but it's at least noise added to the process, and this feels pretty weird.
To make your point, let me make your point. Maybe you agree. If you look at the median number of citations at the very top journals comparison to top field in most discipline, not that much of a difference. The most cited ones are more cited at the top journals, and they drive the impact factor. But if you would take like the least like cited papers in top journals, and you would compare it to like the next level of journals, they're even less cited or equally cited. So clearly there's a quite a bit of luck and quite a bit of like like a placement or whatever of papers into top journals. That's your statement, and I would agree with that.
I think what happens, at least if you look into econ, and I think it applies to probably quite some other fields as well, is that top journals have the privilege to manage their impact factors just by being super selective, right? So they just have extremely high desk rejection rates, sometimes like 90+%. So they filter at the very first stage on a single opinion. Okay, so that's even more idiosyncrasies at it, or probably the most idiosyncrasies at it. And smaller journals probably don't have this privilege to be as restrictive. But overall, it's not, at least it's not obvious whether the average quality or the average median citations or whatsoever in top journals are really so far off from lower tier journals. It's at least not very clear, because it's so hard to evaluate what quality means, right? At least what was super eye-opening for me when I started my entire journey in this replication and forecasting stuff is that, so I started as a PhD student. It was my first project. They asked me whether I would want to join this project replicating 18 AER and QJE experiments. And I said, yeah, okay. Nice to show that these things hold up, that econ does a good job as compared to psychology, right? Because the psych study was already out there. So I was super frustrated when I saw that the replication rate was just something about 60%. So even in these top shot journals published by papers published by top shot authors, it's the very same problems, right? So it's not that they are ultimately of higher credibility, higher trustworthiness or whatsoever. And the question is why and how to get rid of it. It's and of course, these are all far from obvious questions to answer. But at least I think it's worth, even if we don't know the answers to these intriguing questions, I think it's at least worthwhile to think a bit out of the box and consider or think through alternatives that may be worthwhile to give it a try, or to test systematically using research methods, because that's something that is possible. The challenge that we face is that it's so much dominated by just a handful of big players, right? So it's Elsevier, it's Francis Taylor, it's Nature Group, and so on and so forth. So it's a few monopoly players in the market who have immense power, and we as researchers basically fuel their profits by maintaining a system which is so reliant on reputation of journals, right? That's the weird part of the story, because no one forces us to publish with the Nature Group, but we do so because it's the only way to make academic careers. Right? So it's kind of a self-fueling
prophecy.
Yeah, which is super hard to break, most likely. So it's hard to think about how to get out of this default system, because it would, of course, require a critical mass of people switching to a new alternative at the same time. And that's, as I said, it's likely far-fetched. Probably it's also good that it's not happening without having some solid evidential base to rely on. So I think we need more research in this scientometrics domain, where in order to learn which alternatives might be worthwhile to give it a try.
There's something that the one you mentioned, and I really want you to ask Felix this. And I guess your research, my research, and many other people's research, we've criticized Mechanical Turk. And I think you see a move in academia towards Prolific and other platforms, which, they also have their own problems. But the one recently mentioned to me that something I think you saw on social media of AI and the threat that it might pose for actually, collecting participants and so on. So Juan, do you want to take it over? I really want to hear what Felix has to say about this.
So as Annabelle said, especially in social sciences, we've been relying a lot on the Mechanical Turk and stuff like this, like internet poll-based approach to research. But I just recently saw this agentization of LLMs, where you could just point it towards an online survey and it would fill it out for you. And the scary thing, like if I was someone who did research on this, I would be panicking, is the fact that they even put like a question where they explicitly ask, are you an LLM or are you an AI powered whatever? And the AI lied, and it says, no, trust me, I'm a human, and I like strawberries, right? And for me, it was like, oh God, this is the end of online based surveys and research. Like, do you think we are at that point, like where we should be updating, like Bayesian updating our priors, when we see research that has been conducted using this kind of tools?
I'm not really sure, honestly. So I think the first thing that we observe is that there is this huge shift, probably also fueled by the COVID pandemic, where researchers just learned that online experiments are an alternative and that they are just so much more convenient than collecting data in the lab. Right? And it comes with pros and cons. I think one huge pro of online experiments is that they are relatively cheap, in the sense that you can afford way larger sample sizes. So on average, these studies are likely better powered, which is nice, okay, per se. Of course, the problem is that data might be noisy, it's less controllable, and so on and so forth. And then there is this big question mark of, okay, what's the role of AIs? We faced this issue with these mTurk replications as well. And we were pointed to some online tools where you can send IP addresses to, which filters out bots. Actually, we filtered out a lot of participants. I think from the raw sample that we invited for, these were a lot of participants, probably something like 20 to 30,000 over all the 26 replications. I think from the raw invited participants or joining participants, I think we ruled out something like 27%.
Wow.
Based on their IP.
That's crazy.
That's huge. But at least there are tools. There are tools to get rid of potential bots. And now the big question is, okay, how reliable are these tools, right? And I guess that with the more evolved AI technologies and AI botting becomes, the more tricky it will be to actually reliably filter them out. And this is just not clear where this story will end. On the other hand, it was super interesting to see that, of course, it's hard to compare, but at least the replication rate that we eventually saw in the 26 replications on mTurk didn't really differ from previous replication rates. It was, again, this 50 to 60%-ish outcome overall. So it was at least not obvious that they perform way worse in terms of replicability.
Let me
probably have expected.
Let me push back a bit on that, because one of my main fears is that, of course, if we see, let's think of the extreme case where a huge part of the respondents are AI-based agents, right? If this is the case, of course, we're going to be seeing replicability, right? Because these people are going to be answering super consistently. In fact, chances are that results are going to be extremely replicable, right? So my question would... But my question
it depends on how the AI or how the bots are trained. So if they are really trained to represent the behavior of a broader public or of a representative sample or something like that, we probably don't end up in this problem. It's just super unclear. There is quite a lot of research going on in this domain now. Let's see where it leads us. I think it's relatively premature to draw strong conclusions where this will go.
Yes. But I think my question, my underlying question, and the one that I think you're uniquely positioned to answer is, do you think researchers are updating their beliefs about the replicability of these studies or the quality of these studies just because of the existence of AI? So, for example, if you asked me what I thought of mTurk, I don't know, let's say 6 months ago, I think it would be an mTurk-based paper. I think it would be a very different answer to what I think of it right now. And my concerns about it would be very, very different. Like 6 months ago, I would be concerned about the selection sample, the selection bias on the people who actually answer this kind of questions. But nowadays, I would be concerned about are these actually people? You know what I mean?
No, it's fair concerns, definitely. It's super hard to answer. At least I don't have a clear stance on these issues, because it's just so uncertain whether we can really identify whether a particular observation is bot based or human based, and most likely we will have to rely on algorithms, probably AI trained algorithms,
Yes.
in order to identify whether something is AI based or human. That's weird, and it's not clear where this story will end, because it's always this question: who's running faster, right? So as long as there is as long as there is money on the table, there might always be an incentive for people to develop technologies in order to make money on platforms like Amtrak.
Yeah, but my question.
It's an incentive for others to provide tools to identify these guys, right?
I agree. But I think my question is more not about whether or not those are replicable. That's a question. But how are people updating their beliefs towards papers that are using those tools? Like, because I think you're uniquely positioned to answer that question. Like, how are people thinking about those as time goes on? Like, are they Bayesian updating their priors about these type of studies?
I'm not so sure. I think people would just love to believe that MTurk and Prolific are super reliable data sources because they are so convenient to use. That's probably jeopardizing their Bayesian update to some
extent. Fair enough. Like wishful thinking.
It's not the first time that there are problems pointed out. Like MTurk has been through many crises in academia in terms of, like, there's tons of concerns over the years that have piled up, and then people were like, well, Prolific is better, let me move to this. The pool of participant is more credible. So you could imagine at one point another platform that would pop up and would be doing a really good job at making sure that there are no LLMs. You could imagine something like this coming up.
That's what we see with cloud. I think it's cloud research, right? It's basically MTurk based, but with added filters to ensure high data quality standards, and so on. And as Abel says, MTurk has been through several crises with a lot of rumors and many people raising concerns. Still, even nowadays, many people use MTurk just because it's so convenient. And I think in many cases they just kind of overcompensate in terms of sample size, because you can afford huge samples relative to lab-based settings. And after all, I'm not even sure whether this is something necessarily bad. So if in doubt, I probably prefer a huge, well-powered MTurk study to a 20-participant lab study. Right? So,
all right, Felix, thank you so much. This was super interesting. Really appreciate that you took the time to talk to us.
Yeah, we have to cut it a bit because we could still be here like for hours,
I guess so, yes.
Yeah.
Felix,
any last remarks that you want to tell our audience?
Not really. So whenever you see an invitation to prediction markets to forecast replicability, take part. It's fun. Not research, right?
We will. Felix, thank you so much. Abel, it's always a pleasure. I guess I'll see you in the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.